Forms eugenics was always there. What eugenics did was provide a biological underpinning for it. Eugenics provided a biological theory for it. Galton, who was considered the father of eugenics, what happened was he manipulated the information provided by the new knowledge of the inheritance of disease. And he used that as a philosophical justification for the sort of treatment that Black people had always gotten, this disparate treatment. Of course, in the eugenic movement, it wasn't limited to Blacks. I mean, there were many other groups who were considered genetically unworthy, actually anyone who wasn't white and Anglo-Saxon in this country. But it certainly escalated, and Blacks were certainly singled out with amazing ferocity. I talk about, I think what's really interesting is for all the hand-wringing that's done over the German eugenics movement, our eugenics movement occurred first. And in the case of the treatment of African Americans, I would argue that it was much worse, much more virulent, much more effective in terms of sterilization. Vast numbers of Black people were sterilized. The reproductive control of Black people escalated sharply because before slavery, whites controlled Black reproduction, but they encouraged reproduction because the production of slaves was very important, especially after the importation of slaves was banned. But after slavery, the growth of the Black population was no longer an economically desirable thing. And so Blacks were singled out. The same tenets of scientific racism persisted, but now they were clothed in genetic double talk. So that when they talked about, what's interesting is that racial hygiene, racial breeding, these terms were used as often as eugenics during that time. And that's exactly what they were talking about. They were talking about the control of society through selective breeding. And selective breeding selected Black people out. We were automatically considered, undesirable components of the gene pool. And it was used to control many aspects of Black life, from women being surreptitiously sterilized to Black men often being overtly sterilized under the guise of lowering crime and protecting white women from rape. So that was like the most overt form. But there are many more subtle forms, and many of them, I argue, persist today. I look at the administration of Norplant to young girls in the overwhelmingly Black Baltimore school system, in schools that were 85, 95, 90% Black. And what could that be except a huge eugenic thrust? That was nothing but a very crude attempt at selective breeding. And even today, I talk in my chapter about the myth of the crack baby and how that's directly related to the perception of Black women as being unsuitable or unworthy mothers, inherently unsuitable. So that while women of every race abuse drugs, it's Black women who abuse drugs, who constitute 85% of the people who are put in jail for it, who are being forced into sterility by having Norplant forced on them in the recent past, and whatever the contraceptive du jour is. So, unfortunately, eugenic spirit is very alive today. And during the period when it thrived, we were just inordinately victimized by it.
I agree with you that it's still very much in play. Can you give some examples of any particular studies that took place in order to make this happen, this sterilization happen, or was it just something that was, as it is now, just sort of seeping into the culture, and whenever there was an interface between the medical profession and an African-American person, that this took place?
I think the legal concept of strict scrutiny is very important here, because Black women were not engaging in any negative behaviors that white women, or indeed all women, weren't engaging in. But the peculiar focus was upon Black women. So when an article was published, for example, by a physician who pointed out that of the 23 babies he looked at, those whose mothers had used cocaine, the babies seemed more lethargic and less social. Overnight, that became racialized. And suddenly, what we're reading everywhere in medical journals and in newspapers is babies whose mothers are on crack are less than human. A huge leap from what he said. He was writing about a small number a number of children that you really could not infer anything in general about. And suddenly they're talking about all babies using one particular form of crack, of cocaine, a form known to be used more frequently by black people. And these are the babies that we should be worried about. In other words, the babies of black women are the ones we should worry about. We won't worry about the other 83% of American babies, only these babies. And it was just amazing how that took off and how the media just, it was interesting because the catalyst was an article by Charles Krauthammer. Krauthammer began, he said, these babies born to crack-using mothers are golems. They would never become human. They would never be productive members of society. The dead babies are the lucky ones. This man is a graduate of Harvard Medical School. He should have known better. He should have known by looking at that article that this came from nowhere. And I think that's a sterling example of how black people are victimized on the thinnest of, scientific premises.
When was this article written?
I think that particular article was in the late 80s, very late, maybe 1989, in the Washington Post.
Wow, that's amazing. It's truly amazing because it does sound like an attitude that might have prevailed 100 years earlier. So for people to realize that this is very, very present.
Right, it's the same mentality. 100 years earlier, the same thing was being said. These black women are having all these children, and they're all ending up on welfare, and they're subhuman anyway. We need to sterilize these black women. And what happens today? These black women are using drugs, and they're having these babies who are inferior. They need to be placed on Norplant or Depo-Provera or whatever to make sure they can't have any more.
All right, 212-209-2950, 212-209-2950. We're up now to 28, approaching 29 minutes after the hour. We're coming up to the bottom of the hour, and then we'll be on the last lap of the program, as we call it. You're listening there to excerpts from an extensive interview with Harriet Washington. She is author of Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. She is interviewed by WBAI's Kathy Davis. Now, the book, Medical Apartheid, is available this afternoon as a gift to you, together with the audio CD of this 70-minute interview. And these two, in combination, we'll send to you as our thank you when you make a pledge to WBAI at the $125 level. We want to thank you very much. If you already have made that call, you who already have done so, I want to thank you very much. But I'd like to use the next 10 minutes to get a minimum of 30 calls, maybe not 10 minutes, what am I saying? The next 5 minutes perhaps, to get a minimum of 30 calls in, because there's some more of this conversation, some more of this interview that I'd like to share with you. This interview with Harriet Washington, speaking with WBAI's Kathy Davis. There are aspects of this interview in which Harriet Washington talks about biotechnology and bioterrorism. She also talks about the military and the prisons and the role that the military and the prisons have played historically in this process of medical apartheid, this dark history of medical experimentation on black Americans from colonial times to the present. But we need to do this. We need to work together on this. We're operating here on the honor system. So now it is 30 minutes after the hour. This is WBAI New York. Listener-sponsored commercial-free radio, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming live on the web at WBAI.org. I am Hugh Hamilton with Michael G. Haskins, our audio engineer and director of incidental music. Here is the number to call with your pledge of support, beginning right now, 212-209-2950. That's 212-209-2950. You can use your Visa, American Express, or MasterCard. You can honor your pledge with a personal check or money order. You can use the electronic funds transfer system or the installment plan. But we ask you right now to go to the phones to make that pledge, to call WBAI 212-209-2950. This afternoon, we're getting you this, we're sharing with you this seminal work, Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. It is an issue that takes on an additional urgency in view of the recent disclosure, a story that broke only only last Friday that for 2 years, from 1946 to 1948, while we, the United States, while we were prosecuting Nazi doctors for carrying out experiments on prisoners in concentration camps during the Nazi Holocaust, that we were carrying out these horrific experiments in Guatemala on poor people, people in prisons, people from mental institutions. American tax dollars through the National Institutes of Health were being used and even paid for syphilis-infected prostitutes to sleep with prisoners, since Guatemalan prisons allowed such visits. From 1946 to 1948, American public health doctors deliberately infected hundreds of Guatemalans, including prison inmates and mental patients and soldiers, infected them with venereal diseases in what was meant as an effort to test the effectiveness of penicillin. When the prostitutes in the study did not succeed in infecting the men, some prisoners had the bacteria poured into scrapes made on their penises and on their faces and arms, and in some cases injected by spinal puncture. Now, in what many consider to be a twist in this revelation, the public health doctor who led the experiment, his name John C. Cutler, would later have an important role in the Tuskegee study, in which black American men with syphilis were deliberately left untreated for decades. 212-209-2950 is our number. We need 30 calls. We need 28 additional calls right now. There are 2 callers on the line at the moment. 212-209-2950. In this book, Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present, this is the first and only comprehensive history of medical experimentation on African Americans, starting with the earliest encounters between Black Americans and Western medical researchers and the racist pseudoscience that resulted. It details the ways in which both slaves and freedmen were used in hospitals for experiments conducted without their knowledge, a tradition that continues today within some black populations. This book by Harriet Washington reveals how blacks have historically been prey to grave robbing, as well as unauthorized autopsies and dissections. Moving into the 20th century, it shows how the pseudoscience of eugenics, you just heard Kathy Davis and Harriet Washington discussing this very issue of eugenics. This book shows how the pseudoscience of eugenics and social Darwinism was used to justify experimental exploitation and shoddy medical treatment of blacks, and the view that they were biologically inferior, oversexed, and unfit for adult responsibilities. This book unveils shocking new details about the government's notorious Tuskegee experiment. They're revealed in the book and in the interview. The shocking new details about the government's notorious Tuskegee experiment, as are similar, less well-known medical atrocities conducted by the government, the armed forces, prisons, and private institutions. As I mentioned just a moment ago, I want to get to that part of the interview where Harriet Washington discusses with WBAI's Kathy Davis the role of the military and the prisons in this dark history of medical experimentation on black Americans from colonial times to the present. And it's all unveiled, it is all exposed in this book. This book is the product of years of prodigious research into medical journals and experimental reports, long undisturbed. Medical Apartheid is the name of the book. It reveals the hidden underbelly of scientific research and makes possible for the first time an understanding of the roots of the African American health deficit. I am Hugh Hamilton with Michael G. Haskins. Mr. Haskins, might I, sir, prevail upon you to exhort our listeners, even as you did in the last go around, to join us at 212-209-2950.
Absolutely, Hugh, and that is why you're calling. That is why you're listening first and foremost, because of that level of scholarship, and you appreciate that on your radio. You appreciate being able to listen to it, being able to have access to it each and every day, Monday through Thursday. 212-209-2950. You know, what you're listening to, this interview with Harriet A. Washington with Kathy Davis, this is homegrown material. This material that Hugh is bringing for us this afternoon, this is homegrown material. Sure, we have things from all over the spectrum around the country and around the world that we use, but this is homegrown stuff, and we are asking you to support us now. At the $125 level, the book CD combination is yours. Harriet A. Washington and the book Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. 212-209-2950. We have a couple of calls on the line now. We need another flurry of calls, another number of you to make your calls of support. Those of you who have called before the top of the hour, you have done your job. You have supported Talkback this afternoon. But we know there's still many more of you who are listening right now at this very minute, and we want you to make your calls. We want you to support us, and we will send you the book and the CD for a pledge of $125. If you're interested in the CD, as it on its own, as a standalone item, we'll send that to you for $35. 212-209-2950, Visa card, MasterCard, American Express. But we do need to hear from you now. We do want to go back, and we will be sharing more information, but we need to hear from you now. Make those calls. We have people standing by waiting to hear from you.
212-209-2950. Thank you very much, Mr. Haskins. In fact, here's the thing. This material is far too important to be held hostage. So we're going to we're going to go full steam ahead as we usually do, operating on the honor system while you continue to call, joining those who are on the line at the moment. And thank you very much to you.
Thank you
very much. Thank you who are on the line at the moment, because there is this part of this conversation here on the dealing with the military and the prisons. I really want us to get to this. So let's do this while you continue to call, because we are on the home stretch. We are now 22 minutes away from the top of the hour. There's another program coming up at the top of the hour. So we are right now fighting the clock. 212-209-2950. Please continue to call while the presentation is in progress, and we thank you very much in advance for your support. 212-209-2950 as we return to an additional excerpt from author Harriet Washington in conversation with WBAI's Kathy Davis, discussing Harriet Washington's seminal work, Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present.
And then we go deeper into this awful legacy. Let's talk about what's happening in with regard to the military.
That's a very, very important issue and a very good point. And it's also, I think, a good example of what I talk about when I say things have changed for the better. I mean, we're seeing limited success stories because the abuse of soldiers is a limited success story. What happened is that in 1990, the Department of Defense decided that they wanted to test new drugs on soldiers. They wanted to test these drugs, such as, vaccines against various biological agents like anthrax, because they said soldiers would go into battle, they may be confronted with some things, and we want to know the remedies work. This is the rationale they gave. So they went to the Department of Defense and said, we can't take the trouble of going to every single soldier and asking their permission and explaining the dangers. Give us a blanket waiver so that every soldier, everywhere will just have to undergo these, and we won't have to go to the trouble of informed consent, which is, of course, the most sacred tenet in medical ethics. But the government agreed. The FDA agreed. And the next thing you know, the military was subjecting soldiers to vaccines, treatments such as pyrostigmine, supposedly, ostensibly against a nuclear warfare. Although I did have to question, if you don't know what sort of chemical and biological warfare. But if you don't know what agents are coming at you, I'm not sure how you would know which agents to test. However, soldiers could not refuse. Quite a few soldiers were dishonorably discharged, jailed, or both, when they tried to refuse. Typically, when a soldier tried to refuse, an example was made of him or her, discourage others. And quite a few soldiers have died from taking these or become very ill. Some have been blinded. Some pregnant women have lost their children. And one soldier named Jamaica Barber was brave enough to talk to me and tell me about her experience where she came from a career military family, which I could relate to because so do I. Everyone in my family is in the military, so the family business. And it's a difficult thing when that's your background to leave the military. But that's what she had to do because she refused to take the anthrax vaccine and she was forced out of the military. What happened was eventually cases were brought and Judge Sullivan decided that this is wrong. You know, we cannot force people to take experimental agents again without their consent. And he ordered the military to immediately stop doing this. What did the FDA and the military do in response? The FDA immediately decided that these medications were no longer experimental. The FDA approved them, so the military could continue to give them to them.
Such tragedy. So there's a whole history of this that started back with the experimentation of nuclear radiation, and it just comes straight through.
Right. A lot of these a lot of these experiments cited military expediency. Unfortunately, Americans, and we probably don't differ from other people in this sense, but Americans are willing to abrogate people's civil rights when they're told that national security is at stake. And the Department of Defense knows this. And so that was often, an impetus for getting around informed consent or doing things with people without their consent or their knowledge, either with or without legal sanction. In the case of the anthrax vaccine, the good news is that after the FDA approved it, the same judge, Judge Sullivan, said, oh, absolutely not, you can't do that. The FDA violated its own rules in approving it so quickly. And he pointed that out and told them, no, this is still experimental. You cannot just judge it, And so now soldiers no longer have to live in fear of having these agents forced on them. And that's a real advance. I mean, abuse was seen and corrected. And I hope that will happen more often.
I agree. Is the same case true for people in prisons?
That's a different story. We're regressing in terms of people in prisons because imprisoned people are in a very peculiar situation. Unlike many of the people in my book who did not give consent, many of the imprisoned men did give consent. But you have to ask yourself, what does consent mean in the very coercive atmosphere of a prison? One of the ways to better understand this is that these men were in a situation where money represented for them not what it means to us, but money could actually mean their freedom. Money could mean, or money that you earned being in a research experiment, and being in the research wing of the prison could mean escaping this legion of predators that prowl prisons. You didn't have to eat in the mess, which was a site of, the dreaded site of melees and stabbings and all kinds of violence. So being in the research ward for prisoners, say for African-American prisoners, was actually a safe haven. Ironic, because many African-Americans on the outside would consider a research ward a scary and frightening place to be, but for them, it was a haven. So I think that the coercive nature of prison makes consent a problematic, concept. But many of them did give consent and wanted to be in these experiments. However, they weren't told what was being done to them. I spoke with quite a few of them, and I remember speaking to one man who, it was really chilling because he began describing to me a footwear experiment he had been in. He said he had to wear boots strapped to his feet for 2 weeks to test the footwear. And I felt this cold shiver on my spine because I had read about this experiment in the documents. I knew it wasn't a footwear experiment. That had been an attempt to induce foot fungus, and he didn't know. He wasn't aware of that.
So even though prisoners are consenting to this experimentation, they're not getting the full information on exactly what they're being used for.
Far from it. This all happened in the past. This all happened before the 70s, the mid-70s. But for example, mind control experiments conducted by the CIA under its MK Ultra program, they were horrible. They were administering LSD and other psychoactive drugs to these men, but the men had no idea. They were used to going to experiments where they had like painful experiments, but at least they were limited. They would take your fingernail off. They would implant cadaver skin in your back. That's bad enough, but you feel as if you can have a grasp what the dangers are. These men were being handed a pill. No one told them what the pill was, and some of the men still have not recovered from the effects. So these were especially nefarious. Because of the many abuses and the many deaths, because there were horrible conditions, and many men in some experiments died not from the experiment itself, but from the bad conditions. One doctor, Dr. Stowe, caused so many cases of hepatitis, he was eventually banned from prisons. In the 1970s, prison research was essentially closed down in this country. Not completely, but limited such a restricted way that few pharmaceutical companies wanted to go to the trouble. But very recently, a government committee has recommended that prisons be reopened to experimentation. And that's a very, very chilling thought. The rationale is to bring the men medical care, but they're conflating medical care and medical research. Most prisons have very, very substandard medical care, if any, for men. And I don't think you can justify having prisons that will not render the most basic life-sustaining medical care to a diabetic or someone with cancer, but yet will have, experimentation going on, which in many cases won't benefit the men at all and might harm them. So I think, in my opinion, this is a step back.
212-209-2950. 212-209-2950. Harriet Washington there, talking with WBAI's Kathy Davis about medical apartheid, the dark history of medical experimentation on black Americans from colonial times to the present. We're now 12 minutes away from the top of the hour. Coming up at the top of the hour, there's a brand new program, which means we have to be out of here by 3 minutes before 5. So at 48 and 10:58, we have 9 minutes. We have 9 minutes remaining on this program before we have to vacate these premises. And in the next 9 minutes, I'm looking for 40 calls in the next 9 minutes. We're kicking it up a notch from 30 to 40. We're looking for 40 calls in the next 9 minutes, beginning with yours at 212-209-2950. 212-209-2950. I've got quite a few people here to thank. We also have, of course, the drawing that I'm going to remind you about in a moment. And 212-209-2950. You can use your Visa, American Express, or MasterCard. You can honor your pledge with a personal check or money order. You can use the electronic funds transfer system or the installment plan. The book is Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington. The book and interview, it's a 70-minute interview. Harriet Washington talking with WBAI's Kathy Davis. The book and interview together we'll send to you as a gift, a thank you gift with your pleasure, the $125 level. If you're a student or a senior or otherwise on fixed income, we would really want you to get this interview at the very minimum. And so we're making the interview available on audio CD as a standalone item with your pledge at the $35